Danny, first up, it's an honor to have a chance to speak with you. People have called me a music journalist. I don't consider myself a journalist when I'm talking to somebody like you, who literally in the trenches, you do what you do. You're a historian. You know how to recreate the stories that a lot of folks, the old school folks, have gone through. How does it feel being able to chronicle history and especially history of music?
When I started, I was just so excited I could find any kind of a job and when I discovered I started in I got my first job for Billboard, trade magazine in the music business in '68. I dropped out of college. I was still 18 and it was a clerical job. And when I discovered that there were people on the other side of the office that were getting free concert tickets, free records, and just had to write their opinion about rock and roll, I said, how do I get that job? So I was just grateful to have any way into a professional identity because I'd not been the greatest student in the world. Then over the years, I developed, I got into the business side and then came back to writing. And I just like doing it. I always kind of was writing stories in my head from the time I was a kid, and it's a comfortable space for me. Um, this new book that I'm publishing about the interaction between artists and entertainers and Trump was interesting because I was chronicling the 2020 election cycle in real time. That was the only time I ever did that. Everything else I ever wrote was in the past, and in that I was kind of researching daily and then trying to integrating it into a narrative. So that was fun to do it that way. I'd never done that before, but that was more about politics and culture, not just about music. But I still rock and roll, especially, is my first love, and um, I love everybody likes to have an opinion about rock and roll, and to get paid for it occasionally is a great blessing.
Let's talk about this book because this is fascinating because a lot of us were at the same time as you. We were watching and hearing all these things going on, and especially with all the background that was going on with Donald Trump, the election, the US, the rest of the world,
Yeah,
COVID,
yeah.
Karens, Kevins. I could keep going on and on with this, but it was really interesting to see the relationship between Donald Trump, his views and lifestyle with the world of music, and even in a bit of a split with that music on who he was and how they were going to either follow or not follow along. For folks who aren't sure what we're talking about here, please explain what the book exactly is called and what it's about, please.
Sure. The book is called Bloody Crossroads 2020: Art, Entertainment, and the Resistance to Trump. And the core of the book documents the 2020 campaign through the lens of not just musicians, but also actors, directors, comedians, the creative community writ large. In pop culture, I don't cover poets and classical music composers, but I was fascinated with the people that had big audiences as artists and who weighed in on the politics either through activism or through art. Some people did TV series, movies, comedy specials and songs, and then there were a lot of people who did just tweeted and things like that. So that was my primary focus. I try to create some historical context going back to Charlie Chaplin doing The Great Dictator in 1940, because that struggle against fascism then in in terms of Europe was also a struggle in the United States. And it's a lot of the moral and philosophical and political issues from 80 years ago are the same, even though obviously the media is totally different, the demographics are different, and so forth. So I create that context, and then but most of it is sort of January of 2020 through the inauguration of Joe Biden in January of 2021. And I wanted to look at pop singers like Taylor Swift and Cardi B, at comedians, whether it's Wanda Sykes or Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle, uh, uh, sh- sh- um, and
You
people.
talked to Springsteen, I do believe.
I did. I talked to Bruce Springsteen, John Legend, Mandy Patinkin, David Simon, who created the TV series The Wire, and who also did a miniseries called The Plot Against America that came out in 2020 that was based on a Philip Roth novel that imagined fascism coming to the US in the 40s. And he did it explicitly because Trump won and because he saw the parallels between those eras. And some activists, some journalists. And then I just tried to document the reaction to it. There are right-wing websites like Breitbart News that are obsessed with demonizing, quote unquote, Hollywood. They recognize that that's one of the few tools that the Democrats or the left has that speaks in populist language, not just the intellectual language of newspaper editorials. And it's a way of and Joe Biden reached out to the creative community substantially. Every night of his convention there was a actress being the MC of it, and he did a YouTube interview with Cardi B the week after she put out WAP and being, and so that's kind of what I tried to do, is do a granular just description of what people did in the context of a very dramatic year, which included not only dealing with the reality TV show President Trump, who was made many of us very nervous with the racism and sexism and only caring about, the wealthiest people. And also that was the year of COVID and the year of the murder of George Floyd and the reaction to it, and the election itself. So, and then so that's what I try to just look at. It's an alternative version of American politics through the lens of popular culture.
Was this the first time for you to write something like this, knowing that part of the research was going to be social media? Because in any time, this was probably the strongest presence of social media ever, especially because Trump was his baby, social media.
Okay, no question. Social media is obviously a relatively new phenomenon in American politics, and yes, it was certainly my first time documenting that and covering it as a writer. My previous book was about working with Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. I was one of their managers, and that obviously focused on the early 90s when there was just the very beginnings of the internet, and there wasn't Facebook or Twitter yet. And a lot of artists have big Twitter followings. I mean, Taylor Swift had more Twitter followings than Trump did. And The Rock had the most Twitter followers, I think, of anyone in the world at the point when he endorsed Joe Biden. So that became a new playing field in the debate in America about politics, about morality. And the right wing got off to a big lead because Trump himself, obviously someone I disagree with politically, but certainly brilliantly used Twitter. And it was important to find countervailing voices in that part of the culture. There are many other parts of the culture. I'm not saying Twitter defines America, but it's one of 10 things that defines it. And if you're going to aspire to national leadership, both politically or morally, you need to be a player in all of them. So it changed the paradigm in terms of what mattered, and I think it gave more relevance to entertainers who just have big audiences, because there's still such a thing as political journalism, and Congress people are online and everything, but only a few of them have big followings compared to entertainers.
Well, let's get to the nitty gritty. What did you find interesting? I mean, the whole book, of course, is interesting, which is a great read. But what did you find yourself personally being said from the left and the right?
Well, I focused. I don't try to be objective in the book. I'm a left winger. I supported Biden against Trump, and my own ideology is probably a little to the left of Biden in terms of where I originally come from, and I was trying to describe a victory over the right wing. I don't know what I would have done if Trump had won, because I'm not even sure I could have published it, but I mean,
you're right about that. I just realized what you just said. You're right.
I mean, I had a publisher, but I don't know emotionally what I would have done. So I certainly was not trying to be objective. I do refer to the few entertainers who supported Trump because I'm trying to give a picture. And so I write about Kanye West and John Voight and some others, but I primarily was trying to document what many of us called the resistance
Yes.
to Trump, and the role that creative people played in it. And you know, I didn't learn any headline news or gossip or anything like that, but in terms of digging into the nuances of what motivated the people, I have to tell you, I romanticize a lot of these activist artists. I know they have a big ego. Someone like Taylor Swift, you know, is certainly got some narcissistic qualities, like any very famous person does. I don't think you can be a big public figure and not have a big ego. And you know, they sometimes get things wrong, and there are some people that are famous that do things that are really cringeworthy. But a lot of the people I spoke to and researched, people like Jane Fonda and Chuck D, Springsteen, John Legend, David Simon, and many others, I find really moving to me. Mandy Patinkin, in terms of the aspiration to just try to be a good vibe, to just try to stand up for what's decent. That doesn't mean they don't care about making money or they don't care about being famous. Like I said, these are not saints or perfect people. But in general, I do romanticize artists. And my research into this and my analysis of 2020 and 30 or 40 people I spoke to, in addition to a lot of reading, really made me impressed with that part of the culture. There's a lot about the modern world that's kind of depressing and that revolves around selfishness, tribalism, short-term thinking. And I'm not saying that show business doesn't have a lot of those components, especially on the business side, but the creative people themselves, to me, play a positive role. I've always felt that, both as a fan and representing artists. And you know, my feeling is a sentimental and romantic one about that community. I'm still quite nervous about the country, and I'm well aware, as I said, that there are people on my side that are screw ups in different ways. But that was I came away from it really impressed. And there were people I hadn't focused on, like John Legend, who I hadn't really focused on either on his music or ever talked to him before. And the level of thoughtfulness and sophistication he put into his role, you know, really has stayed with me. Springsteen, I've long admired. I had first met him in 1979 when he did the concerts in Madison Square Garden, to the so-called no nukes concerts, to prevent the spread of nuclear power plants because of the environmental and health hazards. And I had co-directed a movie made of that called No Nukes. Some of the footage he's released. He's just re-released, not re-released, but he's just released for the first time some of the outtakes from that on his through his social media just in the last few weeks, because it was the first time he was ever associated with anything political. In the ensuing 40 years, he's been identified with many causes, whether it's the rights of veterans or hunger, you know, food banks, or many other things. But he really emerged in 2020 as an extremely consistent, articulate, and unequivocal supporter of Biden and opponent of Trump. And he has a kind of credibility with his audience that is unique. Obviously, he has fans that voted for Trump. He told me he has family members who voted for Trump, but I don't really think that musicians or actors or comedians change people's ideology, but I think they can encourage them to take an election more seriously. One of the issues we have is reluctant voters, people who don't know if it's worth it, people who are not clear about the difference between the parties. They don't like Trump, but are Democrats any better? These kind of conversations. And I think in terms of raising the level of intensity, especially for those reluctant voters or people who might be tempted to vote third party, because we don't have a parliamentary system. You know, if you vote third party, you're hurting the person who would have been your second choice, and helping the person you hate the most. So I think that's the arena where they can make a difference. And in terms of just having an alternative moral framework, even if it's cacophonous and it's not an organized community, but it's not just about what's in it for me. And I think that the idea of community and old school liberal values to me is still a lot better than tribalism. So um, I um, I really was kind of into it at the beginning, and I was into it at the end, and I just tried to paint a picture, a mosaic of what 100 or so people did that I think were part of the victory last year. And we still have a lot of the same tensions and same problems. We don't know what the future holds for this country, but we have all these giant global problems like climate change and long-term festering human issues like racism. But I think a victory is a victory. I was happy to cover one.
I'm curious though your thoughts on when when you research and speak to people like say Kanye West or a Scott Baio, them, uh, of course they were supporting Donald Trump, and repeating things that Donald Trump had to say. I want to get your thoughts on what was like for you to watch this, to hear this, and making considerations and putting this in your book, and how, if I can say the term, scary was it to hear people like this who you think, intelligent people, whatever, you see them on television, you hear them on the radio, you see them in concert, but then they're repeating things you're going, oh my God, what the hell?
Well, I wouldn't usually lump Scott Baio and Kanye West together. Scott Baio is an extremely minor figure who had TV stardom decades ago and who's a D-list celebrity. Kanye West is a genius. He's one of the great artists that hip hop has ever produced, and I still tremendously admire his music. And he's an exception. You're never going to get 100%. John Voight is, to me, a great actor. He's just has horrible politics. So I can, first of all, differentiate. I can admire someone's art and disagree with what they say politically. That's the case certainly with Kanye West and John Voight, both of whom are artists that I really think are terrific. And then, but they were the exception. So I try to include them in the narrative just to be intellectually honest about the community, but there were only a few of them. The vast majority of the creative community was against Trump, and he knew it. I mean, and the right wing is threatened by the creative community because, like I said, they have an ability to reach people in a way that Democrats usually can't, and so they demonize them. They come up with this QAnon theory that say there's a cabal of people that are child molesters, and they include Hillary Clinton, but they include Tom Hanks, and John Legend and his wife. The Breitbart News. Breitbart was that was formerly run by Steve Bannon, who became Trump's campaign manager, funded by these billionaires that are Trump supporters. They assigned 3 reporters during the campaign just to demonize and ridicule entertainers because they recognize this was they know who their enemies are. And in the past, Democrats and liberals have sometimes been kind of condescending or distant to the creative community, a little embarrassed by some of their excesses. And but Biden wasn't that way. I have to say, Biden reached out and he did a YouTube interview with Cardi B the same week that her song WAP came out, which stands for wet ass pussy. And even though there were Republicans saying she was a terrible role model, he recognized she had tens of millions of followers. She had been a prominent Bernie Sanders supporter, and her endorsement of him, I think, made some of her Bernie Sanders fans feel comfortable with Biden. You can't measure the exact effect of any TV ad, any speech, any piece of political art or activism, but I think it's part of the mix. And it's part of the mix that I think appeals more to young people. I think it's part of the mix that appeals to people that are more dubious about the whole idea of politics. And those are the kind of people that are part of a coalition that you need in order to prevail. Because in the US, we have this 18th century system that was built initially where only white male landowners could vote. And over the years, they finally let women vote. They finally passed, made it easier for people of color to vote. And but it's still a screwed up system. And we have this thing called the Electoral College that gives rural states proportionally more power than urban states, so that you can have a situation like 2016 where Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump, but Donald Trump became president because of this 18th century concoction. So you need it's a steep hill, and then you're up against the power of entrenched money, people who don't want to pay taxes. You're up against the generations of tribalism and fear, and you need all the energy you can to try to move forward. So I just trying to document, like I said, an alternative version, because the political journalists focus on the campaign commercials, the rallies, the speeches, the debates, and those are part of it. But a lot of people ignore all that stuff, and you still need their votes. And in terms of the values of a society, yeah, politicians influence that, so do religious leaders, but a lot of people aren't members of religions, and a lot of people don't believe any politician. And some of them, even if they don't just take their marching orders from artists can change the atmosphere for better or for worse. But yeah, there's definitely always been some right-wing artists in past eras and now. And Trump had a handful of supporters, but it was a small handful.
Yeah, I always looked at it as, what I saw with Biden was a lot of glitz and glamour and recognizable faces that you knew. When I looked at what was going on with Trump, it was either, like you said, D-list or people that you've always known had past problems that have been on TMZ too many
Yeah, I
times,
mean,
or,
Ted
you
Nugent,
know,
listen, you can have Ted Nugent, Donald Trump.
yeah,
Yeah, good luck with that. He had one hit in the 70s, and he's a pretty good guitar player, but not in the top tier.
exactly, exactly. What do you hope folks are going to get from this read? And is this maybe a early reflection on what we may have to look at as the next election comes in, especially with Donald still talking about trying to make another run, or if he has a disciple that could run for him or something like that?
Well, there's no question that the forces that produced Trump are not going to go away, and they didn't start with Donald Trump. There's always been business people that don't want to pay taxes. There's always been business people that don't want any regulations, including environmental regulations. There's always been racists and sexists and anti-Semites and nativists. And so those forces are there, and they attract a lot of funding, because a lot of those forces, not all wealthy people are that way, thank God, but a number of them are. And look, we have midterm elections next year in the U.S. that'll determine the composition of the United States Congress for the second half of this Biden administration. And if the Republicans get control of one or both of those houses of Congress, like they did after 2 years into the Bill Clinton and to the Barack Obama administrations, they will do nothing but try to damage the president every day. In service of their interests, their donors, and their base. And that would be nice to avoid. And so I'm right now thinking, and a lot of people I know in the political world are thinking not about 2024 as much as about 2022, when those so-called midterms occur. And I think the only way to prevail in either 2022 or 2024 is to learn the lessons of the victory of 2020, which is to have a broad enough coalition that doesn't exclude the left, that doesn't exclude artists, that also reaches out to the so-called never Trump Republicans. You got to keep the band together.
Yeah.
And like any rock band, you have people in it that get on each other's nerves, but you got to keep this band together, because if you divide it up, they win. And if we stay together, we win. And that's exactly what's going on in Washington now. Is they're trying to figure out, it's a very broad coalition, how to find a center to do something. And I think they'll get there. I wish it was further to the left. I wish we had more Democrats and more progressives, but I'm really grateful that Trump's not president. And I think it's important, while getting depressed about why aren't things better, to also be grateful about that things aren't worse.
Every time I think about it, it scares the hell out of me. The storming of
The so-called insurrection. I mean, that was a close call, and those forces are still out there. And the Republicans are basically now, after first they're basically aligning with those folks. That's part of their coalition, are neo-Nazis. And I would prefer it if those people don't run the country. So again, this country's had these kind of forces for its whole history. We had a civil war. Hundreds of thousands of Americans killed each other over the issue of slavery. The McCarthy period in the 50s, people went to jail and lost their job because they were considered left-wingers. Vietnam era that I grew up in as a teenager, tremendous hostility between people that were against that war and for it. The civil rights movement, many people died, to get a climate where there could even be a civil rights bill and any kind of a voting rights. So these tensions are not new, but like you said before, social media and the fragmentation of old media have changed the playing field. And there's a level of intensity on a day-by-day basis that's a little different. And it creates, I think, a greater role for artists and people that have audiences, because we don't have, when I was growing up, there were 3 American networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC. Yep. Now you've got 100 different things to reach that same amount of the public. So the right wing has been pretty sophisticated about staying up to date in recent years, and I'm hoping that my side can, the idea of community, the idea of us working together, and we have global problems, pandemics, climate change, refugees. There has to be some construct where human beings can work together, even if they have different religious beliefs or, different tastes in culture. And different types of political legacies. And, it's better than anarchy and chaos. So, I do think artists mostly play a positive role, not 100%. Plenty of problems in show business, plenty of corruption, sexism, and racism in show business. But writ large, I admire creativity. I admire artists. I think they're among the more positive people in the world. The late folk singer Pete Seeger used to say, if the human race exists 100 years from now, music is going to be one of the reasons why. I believe that.
I do too. One thing I want to add in there also, the Trump influence is just as not in the U.S. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Toronto, and during that time, and even after, the amount of protests that I've seen in my city with Trump signs supporting him would scare the hell out of me. Going, wow, it's not just in one area. This is getting around everywhere.
Oh, there's no question. This is a global movement of, first of all, business people who don't want government to regulate them in any way. They don't want environmental regulations. They don't want regulations about how they treat their workers, and they don't want to pay taxes. And it's a global movement. It includes people like Russia, and it includes people in Canada. And you've had your own odd politicians. You had a pretty weird mayor of Toronto not that long ago, didn't you? I mean, what was that guy's name?
Rob Ford.
Rob Ford. So, but we still in America look up to you in Canada as having a more enlightened culture and a more enlightened system. I would definitely trade our healthcare system for yours, our education system for yours. And frankly, I think you've got a better political system too. But, I love this country too. We've created rock and roll and jazz and the blues and Hollywood, and I love being in America, but I don't love everything about American history. That's for sure. We have a lot to be embarrassed by, but so does Canada. I mean, you guys just found those graves of Indigenous people. And obviously in this country, Indigenous people were treated horribly over the decades also. So human beings, this is a human problem, not just an American problem. How to be decent to each other, how to create constructs where people have individual morality, but how to create a social morality. And that's a conversation that includes religious leaders, it includes academics, it includes political leaders, but it also includes artists. And I think right now, the louder a voice that artists can have, the better, given what some of the other forces are.
Absolutely. One thing I do want to make folks clear, Rob Ford did have his problems, but he was never a Donald Trump. That's for sure. I mean, he had some of his good sides too. So, but his problems. So,
that's good to know.
Anyways, my friend, thank you so much for this interview. Amazing book. Before we go, just curious, do you have anything else that you're working on right now that we could look forward to in the future?
I don't know, man. This book is being published. I don't know what day people are going to hear this, but November 2nd is the pub date. I'm
Yeah.
still just in the shock of, oh my God, it's coming out. And this is my 5th book. And I find every time it takes me about 6 months after a book comes out to see, do I have another one in me? And I still have a day job. I have a small personal management company called Gold Village, and I have 2 Canadian clients, Martha Wainwright, who lives in Montreal, and the Trues.
Love Martha. Yeah.
And the Trues, who are from Ontario, and the Water Boys from Ireland, and Steve Earle, who I've worked with for 21 years. So I have a day job, and I'm proud of that. And I like writing, but right now I'm sort of immersed in talking about this book, and I'm just facing the unknown, as happens in life in between projects. But Canada's always been a place that's really special to me, both the artists I work with there and the way folks like you have treated me when I've published things. I hope I can come up with something else, but right now I'm just still dealing with the release of this one.
And I think there's going to be a part 2 to this. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you write. And I got to thank you then, because all the artists that you mentioned, I've interviewed in the past. So I'm going to thank you for those interviews. Thank you again for this interview. Looking forward to talking again in the future. And please be safe during these troubled times.
Thanks, man. You too.